Good evening, everybody. I think that we can start with this 2024 Pareto Lecture. And our lecturer will be Professor James Fearon from Stanford. And welcome, James. I'm really pleased that you are here with us. And he will be introduced by one of our assistant professor, Kasia Nalevaiko. Thank you, Kasia, for introducing James. So let me just say a couple of words. I'm really pleased because you are I think the first political scientist who is giving this lecture, right? Am I right? It's path-breaking, but we only take political scientists who publish on the American Economic Review. Otherwise, we don't accept political scientists here. So that's what we do, because in fact, I must say, James is a pretty tough quantitative political scientist. I could say tough or hard quantitative political scientist. And he works a lot in trying to use theory and models and also quantitative empirical evidence to understand policy events. And of course, what we're talking today, political events, I would say, what we're talking today is really a crucial issue in this moment. What is contemporary major power conflict about? And what is interesting is that, at least from what one can read from his introduction, is that when you start thinking why these big powers are fighting each other today, or almost some of them by proxy and some of them really, anyway, they are engaging in a very tense geopolitical framework that, as he says, as Anthony has reported in his abstract, as Secretary of State Anthony Blinken says, the post-Cold War world is over. Of course, the post-Cold War world was a world that we all loved very much. It was a fantastic world. Now, if it is over, this is a problem. But the issue is that it's not obvious to understand what is the rationale for these big powers to fight each other. Okay. And it's fascinating that if you think about the rationale, in the end, the argument boils down to democracy against autocracies, okay? Which is really a very tough clash, because it's tough on values, okay? And tough between values belonging to completely two different worlds. And actually, I think the end of the Cold War was essentially the assumption that liberal democracy would expand everywhere. And this is something that did not happen. So I think the lecture by James will be absolutely fascinating. And I'm really pleased that we have him with us today, even if he's not an economist. Okay, we don't have this big conflict here. We also love political scientists, sociologists, all of them. So thank you very much from the Collegio, on behalf of Il Collegio and all the staff of Il Collegio. Thank again to the staff of Il Collegio for organizing this, and what we call the Sochpol group for organizing this event, which is really interesting. Also, I think tomorrow there is a fantastic series of seminars that with Diego and his team have organized, to which I hope you will all participate, which is really about war and peace. And today we need to understand it's a great mission, very important mission, to understand a little bit more what is behind wars and what can be behind peace, for which we all hope for, but not easy to achieve these days. Thank you very much. Kasia, the floor is yours. I'll be moving there, and then after James, your lecture. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It is my honor to introduce today's speaker, James Fearon, who is the Theodore and Francis Gebel Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. He is also a member of the American National Academy of Sciences. James, if I may, is one of the most influential scholars in the field of international relations in political science. He is particularly known for his work on the theory of war and conflict. He is considered, in fact, to be the leading expert on rationalist approaches to understanding international relations and he has played a key role in shaping the debate between two major theories, rationalism and constructivism. James' work is not only theoretical, but it's also empirical in nature, as hinted by the President Giorgio. He has made important contributions to understanding civil wars, how they start, international negotiations, why wars happen despite being costly, and how ethnic factors influence conflicts. I will highlight just two examples of his work. First, James has focused a lot of his research on the causes of civil wars. In a 2003 study titled Ethnicity, Insurgency, and the Outbreak of Civil War, he looked at why some countries experienced civil wars after World War II, while others did not. He found that factors such as poverty, political instability, difficult terrain, and large populations, to the surprise of many in the field, were much more important than ethnic or religious diversity in explaining the outbreak of civil war. That was a very groundbreaking study. And if you are a student of the SPS program, and I know some of you are here, you will know James from his 1995 article, Rationalist Explanations for War, that we read every year with every incoming cohort here at the Collegio Carlo Alberto. James thus also embodies, in fact, the ambition of every scholar in this room that, the articles that we have published this year, or will still publish, by the end of this year, will still be read in 30 years' time, hopefully. So this is exactly the other example of his work I wanted to mention, that, as you now know, I am very well positioned to discuss here at the stage. In this article, he emphasizes the need to explain why rationally led states end up fighting a war instead of negotiating, even though negotiating can make both sides better off. James puts forth three basic assumptions about war. First, war is a more costly choice than peace. Second, war is predictably unpredictable. And third, there are no direct benefits from fighting. James calls these pieces war's inefficiency puzzle. He offers three explanations for why bargaining breaks down and why wars occur. First, actors in an anarchic system may suffer from a credible commitment problem in which there are incentives for either party to not fulfill their end of the agreement. Second, states might have private information and incentives to misrepresent said information during the bargaining stage. And third, bargaining may be rendered impossible because of what he dubs issue indivisibility, in which a particular bone of contention is not subject to negotiation. Somewhat surprisingly then, even though James contributed so seminally to articulating rational explanations for war, and he's so well known for his theoretical contributions to the field, James in fact finds that big theoretical debates are frankly arid. He finds that they often don't help explain the most pressing problems that matter for large numbers of people. So James, as I read as I understand your work, is that you really are an involved empiricist at heart. And this is why today he will be giving a lecture on a topic that is both urgent and highly relevant: the current conflict between major world powers. Please join me in welcoming James Fearon.
Thank you very much, Kasia. And I'm going to remember that you described me as an empiricist at heart, and I'm going to refer some people I know to you who would take strong issue with that. So thank you very, very much. This is a tremendous honor. I greatly appreciate it. And, thanks for all the hospitality. It's just amazing to give a lecture named for someone who made such absolutely fundamental contributions that I, was teaching or attempting to teach the undergraduates at Stanford the other day without as much success as I would have guessed, judging from their midterm exam. But, it's okay. Yeah. So, what is contemporary interstate conflict about? So, let me begin with some caveats and apologies, particularly perhaps for the economists in the audience and the tradition of economists in this talk. Despite what President Navarrete said, this is what I'm not going to give a talk. I happen not to be giving a talk that's on the economisty side of my own research. This is very much on the traditional political science, in fact, traditional subfield within political science, IR, a field. I'm not going to show you any regression tables. I'm not going to show you a developed model, although some thinking from models is behind important arguments here, or central arguments. It's more of a how should we think about what's going on in international politics talk that is part of like me arguing with my people in my original field, international relations, and applying this to some case examples. I have no idea how to, well, I have very little idea about how to, Trump was elected after I'd pretty much decided on the talk, and I haven't had time to really think through how I would modify things. Maybe that's something we can talk about in the discussion. Although again, I'm not sure if I certainly don't have any well thought through ideas there. So just to fix ideas about what do I mean by interstate military conflict, the kinds of examples I have in mind are listed here, this is at least a partial list, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'll focus most towards the end on Russia, Ukraine, and potential for, escalating and potential for major conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, although perhaps there are other routes there. Okay, so first of all, why ask this question? Okay, so I'm going to give you three reasons. First of all, there seems to be more of it happening or threatening to happen. Secretary Blinken's statement, the post-Cold War is over, is almost surely referencing in part the increasing major power conflict, and in particular Russia-Ukraine and the rise of China and economic and military conflict attendant on that. Of course, major power, great power conflict is very scary because of the technology and the levels of destruction. The Ukraine war is absolutely staggering in the intensity of the killing and destruction there. What recent estimates having more than 1,000 casualties per day on the Russian side, of which I'm going to guess 30% fatalities per day for the month of August and September. It's just amazing, horrible. The risks of a U.S.-China war or the risks of a Russia-NATO war would involve, and already have in the latter case, non-trivial risks of nuclear escalation, which would be quite devastating in itself and would have a very large global consequences, or could have very large global consequences. All right, second, a common view during the post-Cold War period was that military conflict between major powers was kind of a thing of the past and an anachronism that we didn't really need to think about so much anymore. This was an especially common view in Europe, and especially common view in the subfield of international relations in Europe. I remember I actually gave a talk at a Dutch think tank shortly before the 2016 election, where I gave my talk, and a Dutch professor very, very politely, but said, like, well, isn't all this state-centric stuff you're doing kind of anachronistic? Like, states don't really matter that much anymore. It's more all these other actors. From this perspective, the return of major power interstate war and arms buildups, including nuclear arms buildups, is surprising and puzzling. And I don't think it's, I'm not of the view of like, oh, that was naive. I actually think there are really good reasons to think that major power conflict should be to a greater extent than perhaps it is now a thing of the past. And the key reasons here are nuclear weapons and high levels of economic interdependence. Nuclear weapons make the kind of major power war that was a quite regular thing for a number of hundreds of years up to 1945, very hard to imagine. So kind of major land wars with major, tank or other invasions of taking of large amounts of core territory of other major powers. This becomes much harder to imagine in a nuclear world or between nuclear armed states. Economic interdependence, usual kinds of arguments. The economic costs of, say, a U.S.-China war would be really, really large, given how much trade would be disrupted, probably permanently in some ways, with long-term effects in the Western Pacific. So, last reason, or a third reason to be interested in this, we're entering, as happens when we have these kind of phase transitions in international politics. At least in the U.S., you get a whole lot of commentators of all sorts jumping in and trying to be the Mr. X who defines like the new era. And this is perhaps interesting to some degree, but it also can be influential in that the characterizations of the world can turn around and influence political actors. An example here would be that Graham Allison's Thucydides' trap work is by many accounts quite popular and influential with Chinese leadership. They really agree with this. So what I'm going to try to do, I'm going to try to sketch an answer to the question and with discussion of several examples. First and most of the talk is a summary or relaying the argument and a little bit on how it differs from some of the main contenders, particularly capital R, so-called realist contenders like Allison, also John Mearsheimer. In the kind of key components, which you'll hear a lot more about in a second, of the argument are the threat that powerful democracies pose to the internal stability of autocratic regimes. Second, conflicting preferences stemming from nationalisms. And third, how those first two things give incentives for arms buildups and kind of force posturing buildups, I guess, or maneuvering, that in turn generates risks of armed conflict from preventive war, sort of kind of windows of opportunity type logics. And then I'll talk about Russia and China and end on a little bit of particular concerns about risks in the Western Pacific. Okay, so main argument. So a couple steps here. So first of all, I'm going to claim major and middle powers sometimes just have sharp conflicts of interest where both sides want to change, or one or both sides want to change the status quo for reasons that are basically unrelated to national security. National security in a kind of conventional, if narrow sense of territorial integrity within their current borders. In essentially the language of international relations theory, I'm saying that one or both sides of the conflict are revisionists rather than status quo states, and that their desires for revision are just not related to security in this sense of just keeping what they currently have. So let me comment a little bit about this, because there are some potential misunderstandings based on different ways that these words are used in the literature. Well, one point, this isn't a new thing. This is not something that's changed recently. There's like always or some levels of revisionist conflicts of interest. Second, I don't mean revisionist in the sense that sometimes we use it in the IR field of like very expansionist, wanting to like take lots of territory, like Hitler or something. Just, it could be small, or could not involve like being a major territorial expansionist. Okay, so for the non-IR people in the room, you may think, well, how could that be controversial? I don't think it should be, but important theories in international relations often presume the opposite. Or I think misunderstand the role of conflicting preferences that are unrelated to traditional security terms. There's a lot of effort or a lot of argument that essentially tries to fold everything into a notion of security and or assumes that states are basically status quo powers and that the conflicts arise from, in some way, from anarchy plus trying to keep what they have, security. So, or from misunderstandings or misperceptions, mistakes, essentially. This is sometimes called security dilemma arguments or spirals of hostility. Okay, so back to the main argument. Because conflict and war are costly and risky for leaders, they often have very strong incentives to make deals to avoid them, to manage them, and a great deal of the time they manage to do this. But mainly, I'm going to argue because of commitment problems, difficulties of making commitments in this essentially contract-poor environment of interstate relations, the anarchy of IR. States can have, this leads to conflicts of interest plus difficulty making commitments, leads to strong incentives for arming up in order to coerce changes in the status quo or forestall being coerced, prevent being coerced by other countries on these non-security-based conflicts of interest. Then last step, potential actual conflict then arises from, I'm going to argue, typically preventive war logics that are related to these arms buildups, could be racing in some cases. Okay, so to summarize, the basic idea is you've got revisionists on matters not about security in the sense of keeping what you've got. Second, incentives to arm up, the better to bargain, coerce, deter, better on those revisionist conflicts of interest. Third, preventive war risks from, I'll get into details, but say perceptions of changes in relative power from arming. So I'm going to argue that this basic schema, with some details filled in, fits for major power contemporary conflicts. What are the details? First, what exactly are these revisionist non-security-based conflicts of interest? Second, what exactly are these preventive war risks and where they're coming from? So now I'm going to talk about the origins of these non-security-based conflicts of interest, and this is going to take a little while. This is actually probably the body of the talk. So I'm going to say these days, two main sources. First of all, democracies are intrinsically threatening to dictatorships. Why? Because it's common knowledge that they would typically prefer to see dictatorships transition to democracy, and dictatorships would often prefer that democracies become dictatorships, other things equal. This is particularly problematic when the democracy or democracies are militarily strong, for example, the US, and so might be tempted to support the opposition in a domestic uprising, for example, so-called color revolution, in an autocracy. This, I want to note, here, this is an example of a revisionist preference that's unrelated to national security in the usual sense and in the sense that we usually argue about conflict and reasons for conflict in the international relations field. The US government, at least until Trump, just prefers that other countries be democracies, other things equal. Obviously, you can think of examples of the US supporting autocracies, especially during the early Cold War period. That's other things were not quite equal. Post-Cold War, some of those constraints change, or incentives change. So what does this imply? Looking through the eyes of dictatorships, the US, the European Union, and others in their camp are perceived as dangerous revisionists. Okay, we're the revisionists. Okay, so that's the first source of a non-security-based conflict of interest. Second, just conflicting nationalist claims on territory. So Chinese claims on Taiwan versus the desires of and sense of Taiwanese nationalism that's developed in Taiwan. Putin and common Russian views of understanding of Russian nationalism and what should be included in the Russian nation or Greater Russia, and Ukrainian vision of independent Ukraine, national identity. Okay, so first I want to talk about the first one of those, the democracy-autocracy thing. So first general claim, autocratic regimes and leaders almost always deeply insecure and worry a lot about domestic rebellion and coups. Even when looking from the outside, they look very secure. Nonetheless, they worry a lot and spend a lot of effort trying to prevent domestic opposition from developing. Here's the famous picture from Tiananmen on the left. And this is from protests following legislative election that grew very large in Moscow in 2011. Okay, some things have changed to make this newly challenging in the last 25 years or so. Technological change. So, internet and cell phones. These are can greatly facilitate and lower the costs of opposition coordination. And there are examples of this, in the Arab Spring and so on. Just what their causal effect was, hard to say. But absolutely no doubt that autocratic leaderships have noticed this and been very concerned and taken very strong efforts to try to address the implications of these technologies. So, for example, China, the CCP has developed this absolutely amazing surveillance state, employing millions and millions of people. They're increasingly exporting their discoveries and technologies to other countries, both democracies and both autocracies and democracies. So that's one response. A second is something that I'm going to use the phrase official nationalism, which is the title of a chapter in Benedict Anderson's book, Imagine Communities. And what Anderson meant was he's talking about the diffusion of nationalism to European autocracies starting in the late 19th century. And he summarizes it with the phrase, it's essentially the process by which the Kaiser becomes the number one German. In other words, a transition from regimes, or these, the old regime, where the princes and kings and queens that ruled did not justify their rule by reference to, like, I rule on behalf of the Russian people or the French people or whatever, but were because they were a special family, they got their rights from God or something like that, to a world where they, in Anderson's telling, need to turn to justifying themselves as by being these exponents of the nation, the leading example, the number one German, for example. And so this involves a whole bunch of educational, public strategies and so on to present yourself as the embodiment, and a defender of the nation and national greatness. You see this kind of official nationalism is alive and well, particularly, I'd say, in the last 20 years, although I have not collected systematic data here, but Putin really heavy into this. I'll give some more examples of Xi Jinping on this in a minute, but I think you see it in quite a range of autocratic regimes as well, where they put a lot of effort into arguing that if you oppose me, if you oppose the party, that can only be because you're a tool of foreign powers trying to subvert the nation. Okay. So. Continuing on, after, in terms of this sense of threat on the part of the autocrats, after the end of the Cold War, the US and European Union policies contribute to this sense of external risk and threat from unipolar US power. Listing four main things here. So most of all and most obviously, the US, with coalition partners often, leads military interventions that are plausibly or just openly aimed at regime change, Iraq 2003 being the most striking, but we see it with NATO helping depose Gaddafi in 2011, intervention to get rid of the Taliban in 2001, intervention against Milosevic in Kosovo in particular. Second, a lot of money is spent on campaigns described as democracy promotion, which they were attempting to do with bilateral aid from U.S. and other donor countries to NGOs and international governmental organizations and various aid projects on like developing parliamentary capabilities and securing elections and so on. Putin reacts against this in the early 2000s, and they pass a whole bunch of laws like banning and cracking down on this. Those set of laws are then imitated in China and elsewhere. Third, Arab Spring uprisings, not directly caused by the US and EU, but supported in various ways that were extremely unsettling in the region and elsewhere. The Chinese were very taken with, Chinese leaders were very taken with and concerned about the Arab Spring. But then more than that, even the color revolution. So this is only a partial list of uprisings that got color names once the kind of trend was established by, I think, Serbia in 2000. Some of them succeeded, most of them failed. But these are usually mass demonstrations in a capital city demanding democratization in a country that's already somewhat democratized, but not very much or not at all. The autocrats like Putin and Xi Jinping, but even before that, Hu Jintao, in China, their institutes commissioned quite a number of studies, and they point to various factors, but invariably they stress the dark hand of the U.S. and the EU as part of a strategy of subversion by the democracies. Just a couple examples of Putin and Xi seem particularly concerned about color revolutions. Just before Putin escalates his war in the Ukraine, he goes and visits Xi Jinping in Beijing, and they issue a very interesting joint statement that goes on quite a bit about color revolutions and says that they jointly stand against external forces to undermine security and stability in their common adjacent regions. That's a reference to Central Asia. Intend to counter interference by outside forces in the internal affairs of sovereign countries under any pretext, oppose color revolutions. Later that year, there's a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization where journalists report comments by Xi Jinping that reflect Chinese anxiety about Western support for pro-democracy and human rights activists as a plot to undermine the Communist Party. Here's a little bit from, basically it's based on a very interesting book by Mikhail Zygar called, I think, All the Kremlin's Men, which has a lot of sort of inside dope, it appears, on Kremlin politics. And one of the things that struck me about this is how much Putin was enraged and upset by the Libya intervention, but color revolutions more generally, and sees this as a Western strategy as a chain of revolutions that could eventually reach him. He apparently was obsessed with the brutal video of Gaddafi's killing, and would play it over and over again. According not only to Zygar, but also other sources. And then we have this quote from the defense minister saying that their intervention in Syria helped solve the geopolitical task of breaking the chain of color revolutions. All right, so anyway, autocrats are correctly inferring that the U.S. would be perfectly happy if they were overthrown. They're largely right about that. They have evidence that the U.S. and friends may actively help support domestic opposition if a rebellion gets going. So you see evidence that even friendly or even allied autocratic-leaning folk like Erdogan are get quite concerned. Think that the U.S. is related to the 2016 coup attempt, for example. So from their perspective, the U.S. and allies and partners are the revisionists. And note, revisionists about regime type, not territory. Okay. So this is, and is this just like the U.S. and EU pursued, incorrect policies and shouldn't have done this? I think, you could. There's arguments there that they should have been more careful in various ways. I don't know. But even if they hadn't, I think part of this is just intrinsic. That even having like a powerful democracy nearby is a bad object lesson if you're Putin or Xi Jinping. So it's not just a matter. It wouldn't be like the U.S. can just say, "Oh yeah, we're not interested in this," and that would be entirely credible or solve the problem. In fact, this is why I think I see this as the revisionist preference of the U.S. and EU creating a commitment problem. The U.S. and the EU can't credibly commit not to support a domestic uprising against an autocrat, up to and including some forms of military support. Dramatic instance being Gaddafi, where he had disarmed after 9/11, said, "Look, I'm being good. Don't worry about that," and then. From Putin and Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership's perspective, the U.S. just said, "Oh, there's an uprising. Fine, we'll help them get rid of you." So for smaller, weaker autocracies like North Korea or Iran, this is just a very, very powerful lesson in the value of arming up, and in particular with nuclear weapons. What about Russia and China? These are big, strong states, or big, strong militaries, relative to North Korea and Iran. It leads to, I think, a combination of domestic and foreign policies and military policies intended to address regime insecurity in the changing technological and political context that I just described. So for Putin, there are campaigns of misinformation, disinformation in the US and European states. There's promotion of extremist positions and groups in these countries. There's electoral influence attempts. There's, as I mentioned, big-time campaign of kind of Russian ethnic nationalism at home and an embrace of a kind of so-called all-Russian or pan-Russian concept that says that the three, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia are really just one people. And Russian great power depends on, merits and depends on being united. Xi Jinping in China, we see this broad and deep crackdown on expression, which starts in a smaller way before him, but really gets going when he comes to power in 2012. We see the construction of this great firewall and a huge expansion of state surveillance and control of individuals, which they increasingly are extending beyond their own borders to try to control expression and elsewhere. Xi Jinping gives a speech, so-called Chinese Dream speech, when he becomes general secretary, where he goes pretty hard on the official nationalism element, I would say. He talks about a central part of his platform is the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, says it's the greatest dream of the Chinese people since modern times. There's a line in there about if we don't develop, and here this includes military development, we're vulnerable to attack. And there's an increasing stress on the century of humiliation. I won't read a lot of this. This is shortly after he takes power. There's an exhibit that opens at the National Museum called that's now permanent, called "The Road of Rejuvenation," which stresses the century of humiliation and how the Communist Party has is overcoming this to rejuvenate the nation. All right, so that's the section on democracies are threatening to dictatorships. Now let me say a few things on conflicting nationalist claims on territory. And this is quicker. So I don't think these nationalist sentiments and policies by Putin and Xi are just instrumental. Every reason to think that they're also sincere and also in accord with the views of millions of Russians and Chinese. So for Taiwan, it's in the 1982 Constitution. It's sacred territory. It's all our duty to achieve reunification. Xi pretty clearly sees reunification as a crowning historical achievement that he would like to be the one to bring about personally. Ukraine, Putin published this fascinating well, I don't know if fascinating, but fascinating if you're interested in this kind of thing. Essay in the year before the Ukraine escalation on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And I think one thing I've learned is that this view seems to be actually really shared among Russians. They really say, they think, oh yeah, Ukrainians are our brothers. What they're speaking is really Russian. It's just kind of a different dialect. And that's how they just genuinely see things. Which, if you speak to Ukrainians, or at least a very large number, they categorically reject this. So that's just a flat-out, legit, sincere nationalist conflict. So I think in both cases, the idea of great power status, of selling this or emphasizing it to their domestic public is partly an autocratic regime security strategy, but it also represents just genuine desire and nationalist convictions. Okay. So that's the first detail. What are these revisionist non-security-based conflicts of interest? Second, what exactly are these preventive war risks and where are they coming from? So I'm going to say a little bit about how you get from the revisionisms to actual or possible interstate war by talking about these examples. But first, is anything I'm saying so far controversial or surprising? I don't think it should be, or at least not very much. But in the field of IR, major contenders for interpreting what U.S.-Russia, U.S.-China conflict are about tend to be quite different. All right, so what are these? On China, the usual framings are like Allison, Thucydides' trap. This is just a classic case. It's the same thing that Thucydides talked about in Peloponnesian War. He and his research assistants identify 16 cases over all the centuries, of which 12 led to war. It's a rising power versus a declining power. And what are they fighting over? There's not a whole lot of detail in Allison's analysis, but he'll talk about global domination, hegemony, international order, something, to my mind, rather vague and not even real. Mearsheimer, John Mearsheimer, another influential framer of things in this area, when he talks about the US and China, he says, well, this is just, he says, yeah, the post-Cold War beliefs were totally naive. This is just great powers acting like, as he constantly says, any great powers would. And it's, there's some similarities with Allison there, but his mechanisms are maybe a little bit different. There's a second school of people who say that PRC, who have a different take on China-US conflict, who think that it's more of a mistake, that the US and China don't really have any really good reason to be at odds militarily, and it's kind of a cycle, a security dilemma cycle of misperceiving or exaggerating the other's ill intentions. Okay, on Russia, US, NATO, John Mearsheimer's frame, very well known, I think, including in Europe. A little ironically, I see it as a security dilemma argument that he's making. He says that the US and the EU were, he uses the phrase, transfixed by liberal ideology. So in a way, misperceiving their, think they can just expand NATO, not realizing that that's going to lead to this, as any great power would, defensive reaction by a status quo-oriented Putin. Okay, so let me talk now about Russia-Ukraine, backed by NATO. First talk about the conflict of interest, then arming up, then preventive war, in all cases quite quickly, I hope. So Putin, I disagree, is not just a security seeker who feels threatened by the possibility of NATO expansion to Ukraine. He has strong nationalist preferences, an ideology that claims Ukraine as parts of Russia. He doesn't think Ukrainians are a real nation. And this view seems to be pretty common. He's representing his people on that. I think he was and is threatened by and angry about NATO expansion, but not primarily because of a threat of NATO attack on Russia. Instead, it's that NATO and EU and Western alignment of Ukraine go against his revisionist nationalist preferences concerning Ukraine and Russia as a great power. It's a conflict of interest, not a security dilemma story, I think. I think he's also threatened. It's hard to tell how much these different elements are important, but probably threatened by the prospect of a democratic, more prosperous Ukraine tied to Western economic networks because it would be a bad example for his subjects in Russia. Okay. At the same time, on the other side, there are revisionists, right? Especially Ukraine, especially after Crimea, and the hybrid war, so-called, in Donbass region. And the US and allies and partners are clearly revisionists, trying to move Ukraine out of a Russian sphere of influence and domination towards democracy and economic integration with Europe. Ukrainian leadership and citizens, they have their own nationalist vision that rejects the Putin and Russian vision, and they want national self-determination in the territory that was recognized by Russia after the end of the Cold War. U.S. leaderships, except for Trump, so far as I can tell, and it's going to be interesting, I don't know what to say about what's going to happen here in the next term, just prefer democracy and economic integration of Ukraine with Western Europe, largely independent of strict national security considerations. It's, again, a conflict of interest I don't think is easily traceable to some kind of security in a narrow, traditional sense way. All right. So now we get the rest of the argument. Conflict of interest lead to Ukrainian incentives to arm up, lead to Russian preventive incentives. So knowing what Putin wanted and was taking by force, especially from 2014, Ukrainian leaders have had very strong incentives to build their military capability, to counter threats and coercion by Russia. They've been arming up. They were training with NATO rather effectively, apparently. This is true. And this arming up is going to happen whether or not Ukraine is in NATO. It was happening. They're building military capability, and I think of particular importance is they were building missile capability, medium and longer range missile capability, which I think Putin was very, very alarmed by, because that would limit his ability to invade, to coerce in the longer run. I think Putin could see that Ukraine would keep at this regardless of the NATO question, which it's hard to imagine he thought was like a high probability, given the rules for admission and the kind of demonstrated and stated inclinations of the US and others. He could also see that negotiated deals to limit or stop the growing capabilities, and I think in particular missile capabilities, would be very difficult to monitor and enforce given these underlying preferences in Ukraine and the Western countries. So this leads to essentially a preventive incentive to lock in, the current military balance before it changes adversely over time. After the fact, we can say that he miscalculated or got unlucky with the initial plan of a special military operation, almost like a covert operation, practically in a way. When that fails, why was it? We can't say he was clearly being irrational there. Well, this was a really common perspective in the U.S. and elsewhere in military analysis that it wouldn't take very long, but it did. It failed. Okay, was there some kind of negotiated settlement, arms control deal possible? It would have required a lot. It would have required U.S. and European countries to commit to limit Ukraine's military capability, a kind of neutrality of some kind, and perhaps economic integration to acceptable to Putin. I'm not sure how they can make that commitment credible given their preferences. How would you monitor it? This is not like monitoring, a number of ICBMs that can be seen from satellites. Likewise, how could, if you did try such a deal, how could Putin and Russia not, be tempted to use the military imbalance to get what he wants on his preferences, to coerce change in the direction of undermining independence, democracy, economic progress, anti-corruption, etc. All right. Now, this isn't to say a peaceful deal wasn't always possible and still is if either side is just willing to concede its preferences. And sometimes what I think John, who was my colleague when my first job at University of Chicago, I think what he's saying is that the U.S. and NATO should just have conceded Ukraine to Russia, and he thinks it's just there. He doesn't think that these non-security-based interests in democracy and economic development of Ukraine are valid or something. But given these conflicting revisionist preferences, you're just going to have big problems about how to make a deal that both sides see as acceptable and enforceable. All right. Okay. PRC and Taiwan. What's the conflict of interest? Well, the nationalist claims on Taiwan, well known, probably important for the long-run legitimacy and success of the CCP regime. Xi Jinping probably also threatened by the idea of a prosperous democratic Han majority country as an alternative model. The comparison to Hong Kong and repression there is of interest. Taiwanese population has become more and more persuaded of a Taiwanese national identity over time, solid majority in favor of the status quo and against incorporation into the PRC. U.S. administrations prefer Taiwan to stay democratic and politically and economically independent. I think this is just a straight policy preference rather than a security-based, like, well, if Taiwan falls, then Japan will be subject to coercion and there'll be like a domino effect of some kind, either militarily or diplomatically. You can argue over that. I'm doubtful about those arguments. But I do think, and I think we have reason to believe, that just this simple policy preference, independent of domino effects, has been enough to make the U.S. want to sustain and strengthen deterrence, which is the top line goal in the Biden national defense strategy. Okay, so given this conflict of interest, we've seen just absolutely massive military buildup by the PRC over the last 20 years and modernization program that has been highly, highly focused on Taiwan contingency. The development, their exercises, their force planning, their force posture, their investments, very, very focused on the Taiwan scenario, an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. One of the things that has made the U.S. and others in the region quite concerned. The U.S. was kind of distracted, we say, by counterinsurgency, counterterrorism for 20 plus years, and has kind of been playing catch up on the kind of the military problem the Chinese buildup and the revisionist preferences concerning Taiwan are posing, given an objective of deterrence. It is an incredibly difficult military problem for the People's Liberation Army. A massive amphibious invasion across 100 plus miles of a difficult strait, extremely, probably the most difficult kind of military operation there is. On the other hand, the U.S. is 7,000 miles away, and one of the key elements of the Chinese buildup is what is known as an anti-access area denial environment, which I'll talk about a little more maybe on the next slide. That's the Chinese development of a really impressive and large numbers of conventional missiles that now range. So the first island chain, so-called, extends from Korea through Japan to Taiwan through the Philippines. The second island chain goes out to where Guam is and so on. Yeah, Guam here. No, that's a third island. I always thought Guam was the second one, but anyway, however you divide them up, they have been developing first missile batteries that are stationed typically like in Hainan and all along in Fujian province here, but all over, including in the interior, with short and medium range missiles, very large numbers that can attack targets in Taiwan and U.S. and potential coalition partner bases all along there. They've been extending this out further and further to where Guam is very much now a very, very feasible target for devastation by longer range missiles. Why is this a problem? Well, the U.S. strategy for force has always been, surface-based force projection with carrier strike groups into the region. It was, carriers that displayed U.S. power in the and related to making clear that Chinese military threats in the 1996 Taiwan Straits crisis they had no good military option. They have figured out how to change that, which is to use precision-guided missile technology to make anything floating on the water in this region sinkable very, very quickly. That's the A2AD problem. Now, in principle, it should be possible to get to a stable deterrent relationship, but the path is going to be risky and dangerous. Why risky and dangerous? Well, there are a number of things that could trigger a preventive action by the PRC, either because of sudden changes in Taiwanese domestic politics and declarations or changes to the constitution by the DPP, the independence-minded party there. There are things that U.S. random and unhelpful or stuff that the U.S. politics does. The Nancy Pelosi visit in what was it, like August 2022, leads to kind of a large increase in Chinese operations around Taiwan. A little bit more in a minute. So if the more successful Taiwan and the U.S. and Japan are at developing their own missile capabilities and other denial capabilities, the more that might lead to a perception of a closing window by the PRC. Probably not imminent, I think, but who knows. Let me contrast this quickly. I'm almost done. To Allison and Mearsheimer type accounts. I agree totally that the rapid economic military rise of the PRC has been a central factor in increasing frictions in the region and war risks. But I think the militarization is mainly because of, first of all, these conflicting preferences over Taiwan and the logic that follows from that. And second, the PRC arming up more generally as a contribution to regime security for these official nationalist reasons and just genuine fear of implications of the commitment problem I talked about earlier for color revolution type stuff. So this is hard to see for you guys, but it's tracking PRC military operations and incursions around Taiwan. I think that's the Pelosi visit. It moves to a higher, average level, quite a bit higher, almost doubling after that, and then they decrease it during the run-up to the last election, and then have now ramped it up to very high levels again. I think that they see these operations as primarily deterrent signals to the what they call splitists in Taiwan, the DPP people. And I think they're very concerned that U.S. support, military support, will lead the DPP leadership to forcing their hand, which they don't want right now to happen. On the U.S. side, these kind of operations are often read by our analysts as confirming intent to invade. And I think there is an element of a security dilemma dynamic here in the sense of overestimation of the other side's aggressive intent and underappreciation of how much the other one is responding to defensively to what they perceive on the other side. But I don't think that's the heart of the problem, which you can see by thinking about, like, what would a deal look like? I think that in principle, a deal that brought Taiwan formally into the PRC, but really solidly guaranteed one country, two systems in a really solid way, everyone would love this compared to a giant Pacific War, which would be absolutely devastating. But the PRC just can't credibly commit to observe the terms of such a deal, in part because a lively and prosperous Han democracy within, as a province in China would be threatening to the regime. So that problem makes it, very hard for them to commit to a stable compromise of that sort, which makes it essentially an all or nothing situation. Either the status quo continues or China takes it over one way or the other. In that situation, then, incentives for both sides to arm up, the PRC to become so strong that, as they say, we can win without fighting, coerce change with, just by threatening invasion or blockade, etc. Taiwan, the US, Japan, Australia, in hopes of deterring that. Why not a deal to limit this arms competition? I think the US definitely should be signaling to the PRC that it's putting pressure on the DPP to maintain the status quo. But I don't see how the PRC could commit not to take advantage of a US agreement not to arm Taiwan for deterrence, given these revisionist preferences and the very large military capabilities that they're developing. So I'm going to close now. How would you actually get a war out of all this? And there's a lot of pathways. I just want to mention one thing that I haven't seen discussed much and that I find concerning. I'm concerned that there are really large first strike incentives in the Western Pacific now. How does this happen? Well, U.S. forces, as I described, are very vulnerable to PLARF, is the People's Liberation Army Rocket Forces, this A2AD environment. And that gives the U.S. forces us an incentive to strike Chinese mainland missile and radar sites early on and ports in a developing conflict. Together with the Chinese intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting capabilities that would allow them to find and target U.S. ships. The language in the military discussions here is it's a blinding. You want to blind them so they can't take out their capabilities to find your boats. At the same time, the PRC wants to quickly take Taiwan because it's critical to, everything goes better for them if it happens quickly, because it takes time for the U.S. to mobilize and flow forces into the region. They've got some forces there, but not remotely enough that what they'd have to plan for a significant naval conflict. So they have an incentive to go really fast. That gives them incentives for quick attacks on U.S. forces in the region. Likewise, to blind U.S. ability to target their A2AD on their mainland sites, and their thing is called the Joint Island Landing Campaign. So two nuclear states trying to simultaneously blind each other in hours or a day in the context of major missile and naval exchanges, this is really, really scary. So I think the policy lesson here is that the U.S. and allies and partners need to develop something like secure conventional second strikes, so they could absorb a first attack but retain the ability to target, ideally, moving vessels on the water in the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere in the region. That would be, in addition to, the most effective thing is increasing Taiwan's denial capabilities on the island itself. Okay, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, James, for this really fascinating lecture you've given on such pressing, important topics. And I'm sure that, economists or non-economists, or political scientists, sociologists, everyone is interested to know more about this. And since these topics really touch every single one of us. I wanted to open the floor to questions. We have 23 minutes for questions. So I hope this shall be enough. So yes, please raise your hands. I will be writing down your names if I know them. Please. And if you could also say your name and surname and what institution you are at.
Hi, my name is Jacopo. Is it working? Monterosa. I'm a PhD student of the Vilfredo Pareto PhD program in economics. Thanks so much for your talk. Just a question about whether we know anything about what voters prefer as to, in terms of the two explanations that you were mentioning. Do they prefer a sort of an explanation based on the security of their own country, or the revisionist approach? What's easier to communicate to them, and is there any evidence about what they prefer?
But who prefers?
Voters.
Voters.
Like for instance, in Europe or in the US, is there any evidence about what it's easier to communicate to them around these two motives?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't know that I've ever really You mean voters in Western European countries? What persuades them? What?
Whether are they more likely to be convinced about a national security explanation around, say, the crisis in Ukraine, or is it more likely to be convincing for them, the revisionist approach, say, the idea of protecting Ukraine just because of democracy that needs to be protected?
For their own, well, I mean, presumably it makes sense to appeal to what is in their interest, which would be how their security or other, probably more broadly construed, but also in the narrow sense would be negatively affected by if Putin prevailed. I mean, I think wouldn't it also depend on their prior political partisanship or leaning, like whether they were inclined to believe a story that said, well, the U.S. provoked this or NATO provoked it, versus it's Putin's imperialism. I don't know, but I don't know. I don't know much about European public opinion. Yeah.
Please, Andrea.
Andrea Ruggeri, University of Milan. Thanks, James. I was surprised but also fascinated by the centrality of nationalism in your story. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to read the role of nationalism through your rational explanation of war. So is nationalism the indivisibility story? So I wonder whether, if nationalism is not the indivisibility story, how does this fit with a commitment and asymmetric information? Because for me, the argument was saying, well, it's not a security dilemma, it's a conflict of interest. Therefore, the issue is more about how Russia and China are framing everything as an indivisibility issue. So it's either we get Taiwan or we get Ukraine or nothing. And so I see already you're disagreeing, but I'm wondering how the salience of nationalism therefore fit with the rational explanation of war.
What did you say? The size?
How central is nationalism? Because it's not really about commitment problem.
Oh, it is.
It is about commitment problem.
Everything's a commitment problem. Yeah.
Could you? Yeah. So my question is, could you walk me through why is a commitment problem, and why you cannot solve it with tying hands or sunk cost?
Yeah. So in terms of, if I was going to, show you rationalist explanation for war graphs, one of the key things about the very simple bargaining model of that is that there's a dimension that they have conflicting preferences over. Okay, it's a story about revisionists, right? In the basic case, it's revisionists. They want more territory. How much they want it may vary, or whatever it is that we're construing the bargaining to be over. And I see that as actually rather different than the line of arguments that are associated with Robert Jervis's way of thinking about major power international politics, which is a world in which there are revisionists and there are status quo states, and the game of international politics plays out over our uncertainty about who we're facing. And I want to say that the US-China conflicts are not really about are the Chinese really, Hitler-like expansionists who want to take over the world, but really just this commonly known conflict of interest over Taiwan. Now, I don't think of nationalism as an indivisibility problem stems from it, but it's because of a commitment issue. It's because of, as I why can't you solve the Taiwan issue by saying, like, sure, let's make Taiwan can be a province of the PRC, but just sign these documents that say one country, two systems, and there'll be only symbolic changes to, like, there will be a representative from Beijing who can't vote in the, I don't know, there'd be tons of ways that in principle you could negotiate that. But witness Hong Kong, what stops them from creeping and changing the deal? So I do see it as a commitment issue that it's not like nationalism makes things intrinsically indivisible. We can be very, very creative about, dividing things up effectively. But, and in the Ukraine case, likewise, you can divide it up by having a neutrality agreement of some sort. But what I was saying was that given the revisionist preference, like how would Putin be persuaded that, that they wouldn't be able to arm up or develop their military capabilities, and how would the Ukrainians be persuaded that if they really were demilitarized, that they would be secure against Putin going back to war, going back to grabbing more territory. Yeah.
All right, we've got Christine now.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You started by saying that sometimes what IR scholars or scholars say matters, and of course the Mersheimer is regularly retweeted by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs because they like his argument about this is all NATO's fault. And for the most part, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs wouldn't retweet your argument that you make about Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war, which is, this was about democracy, it's about nationalism, which is consistent with what many who work on the region would say, that, this is really what's happening. But there is this part of your argument about the revisionism, and where does the revisionism lie? So when it comes to the color revolutions and the democracy promotion, in the argument, and I guess this is more of an empirical than a theoretical question, but in this argument about Ukraine in particular, is this to what extent is the story about, or what is the worry? What was Russia's worry? Is the worry about homegrown democracy in Ukraine? Or is the worry about, external democracy promotion? And of course the story the Russians want to say is that this is about Western revisionism here. But is this about Western revisionism? And is it going to be portrayed as Western revisionism, regardless of whether this is homegrown or not? So I guess in your argument or in your reading of the empirics, what is the dynamic here? Is the dynamic that what Russia really worries about is the homegrown democracy, and they're using the democracy promotion argument as a cover for, in part, for their own revisionism, their own revisionist nationalist agenda. So who is it that is revisionist here?
Well, why not both? I don't know exactly what the balance in Putin's mind of how much he believed it was the U.S. and Victoria Nuland versus homegrown. I don't know. I think we have a whole bunch of indications that suggest he really did think that the U.S. was like driving it. And there's a whole bunch of things about their misunderstandings and the way they approached February 22 and the invasion, which suggest a deep misunderstanding of Ukrainian sensibilities. But I don't know exactly. But Putin's not wrong to think that whether he's right or wrong about how homegrown it was. He's not wrong to think that the U.S. and the EU were supportive of the Orange Revolution, the changes, throwing out Yanushchenko. So maybe I'm not totally getting your question. do you want to try going on?
No, I'm curious about how you
Okay.
read it, but I guess the concern is that if one of these actors is revision, or one set of actors or one side is revisionist and the other is not, but there's an incentive for the revisionist side to portray the other side, of course, as revisionist in this. Like there's a huge incentive for Russia which in Russia has meddled in this region, has been revisionist in this region, to say, well, this is because the West is being revisionist. So the revisionism of the West is potentially fabricated to cover or to excuse the revisionist aims of Russia. So I guess it does matter where does the revisionism lie?
Yeah, no, I mean, I 100% agree that there are these incentives and that they were absolutely doing what you're saying. But I don't think that makes it the U.S. Less truly revisionist in the sense of they prefer a kind of regime in Kyiv that's different from what Putin prefers.
All right, just in the spirit to move on. Next person is Manuel on the list. If you could keep your question to 30 seconds, that would be great. Thank you.
That's not my, that's not my strength, actually. But, thanks for your presentation. I'm Manuel. I'm a colleague of Christian at University College London, but currently a research fellow here at the Collegio. That doesn't count as part of the 30 seconds. I like the revisionist versus status quo kind of juxtaposition, because it seems to be able to accommodate a whole lot of these kind of global battles that we've observed over the course of history. You've really very much focused on democracy versus autocracy in the post-Cold War period. But of course, you could say during the Cold War, it was communism versus capitalism, and that's why the US supported all sorts of authoritarian regimes that were actually capitalist, right? So I would like to take a broader historical, or I would like you to take a broader historical perspective and perhaps say a few words about previous historical instances of such, what revisionist versus status quo meant at different points of global history, and what these instances tell us about the way out of the commitment problems.
Great. So this is new. This is new stuff for me, and I can't do a good job with that. But I'd say part of me wants to say this is actually the whole story back to the French Revolution. The French Revolution in the 19th century terrifies the monarchies. And you have a whole century plus of monarchies and official nationalism, like Anderson talks about, fearful about liberalism and mass demonstrations in their capital. And I think that's a big part of the Cold War, too. So I don't think I have an answer to your question, but I can't give you an account of the Cold War that develops this idea, and obviously that's not the only thing going on there. But I do think that the Soviet Union was had these same autocratic concerns. There's a very interesting book by Mark Trachtenberg which says that the Berlin crisis and the hot part of the Cold War has as a central feature Moscow worrying that if the East German regime is overthrown and Germany reunifies under the West, that this could have knock-on effects in the rest of Eastern Europe, as more or less happened eventually. So I do think these same kind of concerns are present, but I can't give you a full account.
Okay. The next person is Daniel on the list.
Thanks. Daniel Auer from the Collegio Carlo Alberto. I have, maybe it's partly addressed and related to Manuel's question. So my question would be very short. what do you think is the main difference to the Cold War and today? Or is it history repeating itself?
Big question that I don't think I can give a very good answer to. I mean, one difference that does seem to be very important between U.S., NATO, Soviet conflict and U.S. PRC conflict is that the Soviet Union was economically super cut off from the, had its own interest. There was some. Compared to China, totally, massively different. I mean, China's like the big trade partner, goes in the last 25 years from being very small to like being the major trading partner of practically the whole world except for some Latin American countries and a little bit of Europe, I think. So that's really different. And I don't think we've really absorbed, or at least my field, the IR people and people like Allison or John Mearsheimer, I don't know, like, in talking about, like, the PRC has really strong, I mean, it's their whole growth strategy, export-oriented industrialization depends on selling stuff to rich countries. And like, how does that, people like in the realist part of IR have generally been kind of, not exactly dismissive, but kind of dismissive about economic interdependence as a important factor for affecting the probability of war. But I don't know. I think this time is different in that respect, but I don't know how it plays out. Maybe they're right. Maybe it won't actually matter.
Diego.
Thank you. Very brief question. Can you think of a way of testing whether you or Mearsheimer are right? And would it matter?
Did you see the Aperol spritzes at the start? This is like more like a cocktail. I get to talk.
Having the possibility of listening into the talk of the actors.
I think yes, but I think it is at the moment. I don't know how to do it except, or I think rather qualitatively, in terms of looking at what they say and do domestically. I mean, John Mearsheimer is not, as is true of many people in my field, he doesn't seem to care very much about, he just asserts these things. And, I've seen when he interacts with like Russia experts or they say, well, look, this is just not consistent with XYZ, and he himself is pretty resistant. So I don't know, I'm kind of floundering around here, but I think one of the issues is that the security, saying like, oh, it's all about security is very vague, and you can make it cover all kinds of things. So to get to your good question, maybe part of the work needs to be a little more conceptual about how we'd define the Mearsheimer type argument in a way that it could actually be assessed with data.
All right, now we're going to gather 4 questions. We'll let you write them down, and then you just decide which one you want to answer. First is the woman on the back. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Thank you. I'm Lorenza Fontana, Collegio Carlo Alberto, University of Torino. I want to bring you back to the historical dimension. And if I understood correctly your argument, the way you describe this conflict of interest and preferences framework is as a feature of democracies. However, I wonder if more than democracies, what matters is some other characteristics of a certain kind of democracy which happen to occur in the post-Cold War, so perhaps linked to features such as liberalism or neoliberalism. If that's the case, and therefore it's not democracy itself, but something else that occurs in certain kind of democracies. And as some scholars are arguing now, we're seeing democracies as we knew them dying. So, erosion of institutions, the rise of strong leaders, nationalism, populism. Should we expect your framework to persist in the next few decades, or should we see some changes in the way in which states and democracies are expressing their preferences?
Okay, good.
Now, there are two questions here in the front. First is Giorgio.
Well, I have three questions in one, so I'll try to be brief. Now, the first one, the historical example. I think there is a new paper of the IMF which is very interesting that shows that there is a very rapid decline in trade interaction between what they call geopolitical blocs, if I can use this term, which is comparable to what happened during the Cold War. Because in fact, you had all the part of Eastern Europe that was much more integrated into Western Europe. Russia was not such a big, maybe, trading partner, but it was quite considerable. And the Eastern European countries were, had been, at least before the Second World War, big traders with the rest of Europe. So in that sense, you had, and the data show that there is a similar decline, but this is not my question. My question is the following. Don't you think that now we are moving towards a situation where autarchies are gradually more and more able to turn over democracies, in the sense that when your story starts, okay, the democracies having a big effect in autocracies, the revolution in North Africa, Ukraine, all the examples you gave, we were still in a world where the dominant power was the West and the US, and essentially China, Russia were not as powerful. Now, as China became more powerful, not only because of military reasons, but a lot, as you said, for economic reasons, then the West started fearing a lot about China in different dimensions, because they were taking away jobs, because they were having an effect on the democratic debate through cyber effects and things like that. So there was really a concern that those autocracies could have effects in reverting democracies. And I think Trump is a little bit the outcome of this. And Trump is certainly, I don't know whether it's a reversal of democracy, but certainly it's a big jump towards autocracy, even in the US. So can you have, does this narrative make sense?
Please go ahead. Yeah, the microphone is there. If you could pass it on, thank you.
Okay. Yes. Okay, you start your presentation by telling us that it's not really a problem of security, it's something else. Coming from domestic political science, obviously, I can conceive the term of security in a different way by looking at the security of the leadership in the autocracy. So, there is any added value in considering two-level games instead of only the relationship among states? And if there is an added value in considering also the domestic game, is it possible, for instance, to predict that the worsening of economic condition in China can accelerate what you show us? So, I mean, there is also a problem of keeping the status quo for the leader inside the country. So in other terms, keeping the authority, keeping the power. And all of these maybe can change or can improve the explanation. And maybe can be considered.
And the last question is mine. I will use my special status here. I'm going to be very quick. How does public opinion enter this picture? And how, especially in a situation, in a democratic situation, how does public opinion bind democracies in the situation of potential conflict? So please, now you don't have to answer to all of the questions that you were asked. Please, choose your favorite one.
Okay, because we're basically done, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for all the questions. Very good. And as I said, this is early stages, and so it's very useful. Democracy or role of democracy? Yes, I think that, I tried a little bit to say, not very clearly, that that it's partly the policies that the US and the EU pursued in the post-Cold War, but I also think it's partially intrinsic, in that there's this, this kind of regime security threat which democracies kind of just pose to authoritarian states back to the French Revolution is a thing. Now, that's not to, I think, another way of interpreting your question was, is it democracy or U.S. democracy? And U.S. Interpretation of its, global mission to spread democracy. Yeah, I think that's part of it. You said, what about the effects of populism? Yeah, one implication of that, I guess I have to think this through more, but kind of the first order thing, if you buy this analysis, would be that should lower major power conflict because you'll see less regime threat. Trump will be less threatening to Putin, and Trump may say, yeah, sure, take Ukraine. I don't care about democracy there. So that would be the, first order reaction, perhaps. Question, can autocracies overturn democracies more readily now? I don't think so. Yes, they have some new instruments and they're trying, but I really don't think that the kind of nationalist populists like Trump and others, they may have been helped on some very small margin by, social media and misinformation, but I think it's fundamentally homegrown. That's what I'd say about the U.S. I can't really speak to the European cases there. Security of the leadership. Yes, I used the term regime security. That's what I meant. Yes, and I'd say yes, that is a different way of thinking about security than the international relations field normally associates with it. But yeah, I'm trying to argue that that's, if you want to understand major power conflict in the last 25, 30 years at least, that should be front and center. So I very much agree that, that implies that one wants to do an analysis of the domestic politics that's going to be less sketchy than what I'm able to do here. Then the last question, how does public opinion affect conflict risk, or?
Yeah, since, public opinion can bind the democratic response in this situation of potential conflict. Yeah,
I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that, except, I think the U.S. public opinion, another effect of U.S. democracy, U.S. foreign policy, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, post 9/11, is that I think it has really soured a lot of voters in the U.S. on, has made them supportive of the kind of more take care of our problems at home and don't mess around abroad aspect of Trump. I don't know how much that applies in other countries, but again, that would, like with populism, work in favor of mitigating some of the regime security threat tensions that I'm saying have been in play. It doesn't affect the nationalist, the flat nationalist conflict dimension, but it could affect the willingness of the traditional high-income democracies to engage. It already seems to have done that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let's give an applause to James Fearon again. Thank you everyone for coming. We know that it has been a very thought-provoking discussion. Thanks so much for coming.